Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Mr. Merrigan's Moments in History, U.S. History Edition. So today, we're going to talk about a couple of things again on that road to the Civil War. We're going to talk about, first, the importance of a Supreme Court case called the Dred Scott Decision, and that's why we're looking at the Supreme Court building right now. The important role that this decision plays, again, as another catalyst towards the Civil War. We're also going to talk about the rise of Lincoln, and then we're going to talk about the foreshadowing of the words, some of the final words of John Brown, who we talked about earlier. So, what's our learning objective for today? We're going to be able to understand and to explain the significance, the importance, why in so many ways the Dred Scott decision plays a role in that road to the Civil War. So let's go ahead and dive right into it. So to give ourselves a little bit of context, a little bit of background, we know a little bit about some of the changing politics. So in 1854, a lot of the anti-slavery members, mostly in the North, from the Democratic Party, the Whig Party, and the Free Soil parties, begin to join together to form what it's going to become known as the Republican Party. And for my listeners and for my students, make sure you keep in mind that political parties have changed a lot. So the Republican Party that we know today in the 21st century is not the same as the Republican Party you would have seen in the middle of the 19th century, in the middle of the 1800s. So just keep that in mind. Now, the Republican Party finds its strength and its support in the North. In fact, there is almost no support in the South. And so it shows that further sectionalism that we keep driving and we keep talking about as we get closer and closer to the Civil War, because this is one of the big things, is people identifying by their region over their country. And you're seeing the roots of that divide are going to come to bloom here pretty soon. So fast forwarding a little bit to 1856. The presidential election. Okay, we've got a Republican, John C. Fremont. He's going to run against the Democrat, James Buchanan. And again, Buchanan being a Democrat, he supports the idea of popular sovereignty. Again, that people should get to choose. And in the case that we're talking about, these new states, these new territories on the issue of slavery, we talked about that with Kansas in our last section. So in addition, former president, Miller Fillmore ran as a member of the American or the Know Nothing Party. Remember, this is a party that was very concerned about the influence of immigrants and wanted to take care of American citizens first. So with voting very much along very rigid sectional lines, Buchanan is going to win the election. However, Fremont is going to show that there is growing support for the Republican Party, and that's going to be very important for the next presidential election in 1860. We'll get to that a little bit later. So just to kind of check in, what again is this idea of popular sovereignty? Is it the idea that slaves should be free? Is it B, the idea that the popular vote, not the electoral vote, should decide an election? Is it C, the joining together of members of different political parties to form new parties, like in the case of the Republican Party? Or is it D, the idea that each state or territory should decide on the issue of slavery independently? So take a moment, think about that, pause the video if you need to, and think. But keep in mind, we've been talking about this idea of popular sovereignty. And in the context of what we're talking about, D's the best answer, right? We talked about Kansas. We talked about Nebraska. And we talked about just now John Buchanan being the one who supported this idea. So in 1846, we have an enslaved African American by the name of Dred Scott who decides to sue for his freedom because as he moved with his master and went through his journeys even somewhat independently later, he was once living in Illinois and Wisconsin territory where slavery had been banned. And so his idea was that having lived in these areas independently where slavery was illegal, he was no longer a slave. So this makes its way all the way up to the Supreme Court. in 1857, and that's where we get Chief Justice Roger Taney, and the majority of the Supreme Court made a ruling. Here's what their ruling said. It said, 1, that Scott had no right to bring a lawsuit because he was not a citizen. So this is a big blow to the idea of seeing African Americans as citizens of the United States. Instead, it sees them as property. And so it's a big challenge for the Republican Party, who's trying to support this idea of abolitionist movement. The abolitionist movement certainly being led by many prominent African Americans. And so this court case in many ways just is going to further divide people on this issue of slavery. It also says that an enslaved person was property, which we mentioned here just a moment ago, and that the Fifth Amendment prohibits Congress from taking away property without due process, right? So the idea here is that because Dred Scott is African American, he's not a citizen, he's property, and therefore, without due process, that property cannot be taken from it. Now, the last piece of this decision really sets out a catalyst for the future, because it says that these compromises that we talked about earlier, the Missouri Compromise, and also this idea of popular sovereignty, where the people get to choose, all of that is unconstitutional because Congress has no right to regulate slavery. So if states say they're going to ban slavery, maybe they don't have the right to. This is going to be such a decisive decision and such a controversial one moving forward. And it's only going to further the divide because people who are anti-slavery are enraged by this decision, and people who are pro-slavery are emboldened by this decision. So again, this ruling just angers Republicans, and it, again, further adds the divide in the country and the separation between people who supported the abolition of slavery and those who did not. Another check-in question here. Excuse me. Supreme Court decision in the Dred Scott case stated which of the following? A, that enslaved persons could bring lawsuits. B, that Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in any territory. C, the slave trade should be abolished. Or D, the Missouri Compromise was, in fact, constitutional. So take a moment, think about it, pause if you need to. All right. Best answer there is B. Congress has no power to prohibit slavery in any territory. Now, another idea that I want to kind of build upon a little bit later, especially as we get closer to the election of 1860, is we have to, of course, introduce the man himself, Abraham Lincoln. So Lincoln certainly had kind of an up and down career in politics, but the Lincoln Dougals Debates, primarily over slavery, placed this little-known politician, the rail splitter, Lincoln, into the national spotlight. So in 1858, there's a Senate race in Illinois. And again, the Illinois rail splitter here, Lincoln, is running against Douglas. And so on one side, you've got Stephen A. Douglas, who's a Democrat, and Abraham Lincoln, who is a Republican. So Lincoln challenges Douglas to a series of debates, and again, the main topic was slavery. I mean, at this point in history, this is certainly the one that, again, has divided the country up the greatest. And though he narrowly lost this election, in fact, Lincoln lost a few elections before becoming president, Lincoln did gain a lot of national attention and national reputation as a very clear thinker, and he was seen as a very persuasive speaker. Enough to the point that we'll see later in 1860, the Republican Party wants to nominate him as their nominee for President of the United States. So, also looking at another important event in 1859, John Brown is going to lead a raid on an arsenal in Harper's Ferry, which is in Virginia. And in going about this, his grand hope is that he can arm enslaved African Americans and start a revolt against slave owners, against slaveholders. This raid fails. He tries several attempts at, they come in through the bridge and they're trying to make their way, but ultimately it's a failure. And what we're going to see is that John Brown's going to be sentenced to death. So let me read this quote here on the execution of John Brown from the Anglo-African magazine, which was in December of 1859. As he stood out of the door, a black woman with a little child in her arms stood near his way. He stooped for a moment in his course, stooped over, and with the tenderness of one whose love is as broad as the brotherhood of man, kissed the child affectionately. So, even to the point where he was making his way to the gallows, John Brown really believed in this idea that he again was chosen, but ultimately is going to fail as far as his role in trying to end slavery. And one of the last things that John Brown says is, I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land, and again he's referring to slavery here, will never be purged away but with blood. These words are going to prove to reign infinitely true as we get on our way to the Civil War. Compromises haven't worked. Supreme Court decisions have only further divided things. And there just seems to be no way other than to end it with war. Or in this case, again, as John Brown puts it, with blood. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's going to wrap up our section here. And it puts us that much closer to the Civil War. And in the next video, we're going to talk a little bit more about those final events, including the attack on Fort Sumter. So, for my students, make sure you've been following along with the guide notes. Please ask any questions that you have. Those of you who are following along and listening for understanding, thank you so much. Again, I hope that we're helping you to get a little bit more knowledge for that context of American history and just the fascinating story that is the story of our country. So, thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day.